Did you know that all pagan religions share a striking similarity? Although the names of their gods may be different, the characteristics and forms of worship are often the same. This suggests that all mystery religions may trace their roots back to a common origin. So in the last session, we talked about the forgotten occultic roots of America. But we also need to understand that pagan religions have their origins in ancient civilizations. In this session, we're going to talk about the source of all mystery religions. Their beliefs, symbols, and rituals point to a single source, the serpent. The ancient bloodline families, world leaders, and all who seek wealth without submitting to the Most High bow the knee to another source. That source can be found in Genesis 3. When you read verses 14 through 15, you'll see that a war was declared when the Most High cursed the serpent and said that he would put enmity between its seed and the woman's seed. This was speaking about something that would occur in the natural as well as the spiritual realm. The enemy's been doing everything in his power to destroy man. His tactics has not changed. He's still using lies and deception to entice men to reject truth. Messiah made it plain in Matthew 6:24 that you cannot serve two masters. You'll have to choose. It's either the Most High or mammon. Well, what's mammon? Earthly goods, property, or riches, and is often associated with materialism and greed. If you don't get those things from the Most High, there is only one other source, the God of this world. And He will give you money and power. He'll give it to those who will obey Him and worship Him. Let's see how the serpent has attained worship since Genesis 3. We're going to look at this book called Worship of the Serpent. It says the worship of the serpent is supposed by Bryant to have commenced in Chaldea and to have been the first variation from the pure Zabiism. That it was intimately connected with Zabiism cannot be doubted, for the most prevailing emblem of the solar god was the serpent, and wherever the Zabian idolatry was the religion, the serpent was the sacred symbol. But the universality of serpent worship and the strong traces which it has left in astronomical mythology seem to attest to an origin co-equal with Zabiism itself. The earliest authentic record of serpent worship is to be found in the astronomy of Chaldea and China, but the extensive diffusion of this remarkable superstition through the remaining regions of the globe, where Chinese wisdom never penetrated and Chaldean philosophy was but feebly reflected, authorizes the inference that neither China nor Chaldea was the mother, but that both were the children of this idolatry. He's basically telling us that serpent worship began somewhere and then branched out into various regions. And this happened when the people were scattered after the Tower of Babel. They took the religion that was taught to them by Nimrod into the areas where they went. And we can see various forms of it reflected in world religions. They may have different names for their gods, but there are certain characteristics that are the same in all of the pagan religions, and we'll get to that. The author says, when you follow the traces of the serpent, you will see that few ancient nations of any celebrity will be found which have not at some time or other admitted the serpent into their religion, either as a symbol of divinity or a charm or an oracle or a god. It says, into the creed of some, he has insinuated himself in all these characters and is so mixed up in their traditions of the origin and end of evil that we cannot, without violence to all rules of probability, reject the consequence that the prototype of this idolatry was the serpent in paradise. So it goes back to the war that began in the Garden of Eden. This goes on to say that the name of the national god Bel is supposed to signify more than Lord, and it was sometimes appropriated to deified heroes. It was more probably an abbreviation of Bel, which is the serpent god. The Greeks called him Beliar, which is interpreted by Hesychius to signify a dragon or great serpent, from which we may conclude that the serpent was at least an emblem or symbol of Bel. The author points to a passage in the apocryphal book Bel and the Dragon, where it talks about a great dragon that the Babylonians worshipped. Cyrus was serving as the king, and he wanted Daniel to worship the dragon because he believed that it was a living god. Well, Daniel said the dragon was just brass. Cyrus responded by saying that the dragon eateth and drinketh, so how can you say he's just brass? Daniel refused, and of course he was thrown into the lion's den. Now the author is basically saying here that if the apocryphal book of Bel and the Dragon is true and founded on tradition, then we must conclude that the dragon or serpent, for the words are synonymous, was something more than a mere symbol, and we must conclude that live serpents were kept at Babylon as objects of adoration. The custom was observed at Thebes in Egypt and also in Athens. This verse from Ezekiel 29:3 is going to confirm what I just read. The Most High is addressing Pharaoh through the prophet Ezekiel. And he says, speak and say, thus says the Most High Yah, behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, which has said, my river is mine, and I have made it for myself. So the Most High refers to the Pharaoh as king of Egypt, then talks about the great dragon in the rivers that's puffed up in pride and claiming that he made the rivers for himself. Two beings are being addressed, the Pharaoh, which is a title for the ruler, and the dragon or the serpent. Pharaohs were considered both mortal rulers and gods. So this verse is referring to a deity being worshipped by the pharaohs of Egypt. It was the dragon. Now let's go back to the book. The author says, from the Chaldeans we are told that the Hebrews obtained the word Abaddon as a title of the prince of darkness. This word may signify the serpent, Lord. Heinsius, cited by Bryant, makes Abaddon to be the same as the Grecian Python. It is not to be doubted that the Pythian Apollo is that evil spirit whom the Hebrews call Ab and Abaddon. The Hellenists call it Apollyon, and the Greeks Apollo. This is corroborated by the testimony of St. John, who says they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in Greek Hellenistic tongue has his name Apollyon. This same angel of the bottomless pit is in another place called by the evangelist the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan. Now it goes on to say, subject to the king of Babylon was Assyria, and the people of this country are said to have borne a dragon upon their standard. It is observed by Bryant that in most countries the original military standard was descriptive of the deity they worshipped. It is certain that the Roman soldiers paid great veneration to their military insignia, almost amounting to worship, from which we may infer that the devices on them were originally emblems of the gods. Their chief ensign, the eagle, was sacred to Jupiter. From the practice of the Romans, we may obtain an insight into that of the other nations of antiquity. For in matters of superstition, it is astonishing how nearly people geographically the most remote approached each other. From the Assyrians, the emperors of Constantinople are said to have borrowed the dragon standard. The same standard was also borne by the Parthians, Scythians, Saxons, Chinese, Danes, and Egyptians, people who were in a greater or less degree addicted to serpent worship. We may therefore infer that the dragon ensign of the Assyrians denoted their devotion to the same idolatry. So this religion of serpent worship is called Ophiolatreia, and we see that it began in Babylon and it branched out to the rest of the world. This is how the ruling elite get their power. And they have to do certain things to keep that power. But let's go back to this. It says the hierogram of the circle wings and serpent is one of the most curious emblems of Ophiolatreia and may be recognized in almost every country where serpent worship prevailed. It forms a prominent feature in the Persian, Egyptian, and Mexican hieroglyphics, China, Hindustan, Greece, Italy, and Asia Minor, as distinctly, though more rarely, exhibited, and it has even been found in Britain. It seems to have been a general symbol of consecration, and as such is alluded to by the poet Perseus. So it says, Perseus is saying here two snakes are mentioned, which is the hierogram of the worshippers of the two principles, each of whom is represented by a serpent. Often, however, only one serpent appears issuing from the winged circle, and sometimes the circle is shorn of its wings. As a symbol of consecration, the ophite hierogram appears over the portals of the Egyptian temples and may be recognized even in those of Java. The Druids, however, with the consistent magnificence which characterized their religion, transferred the symbol from the portal to the whole temple, and instead of placing the circle and serpent over the entrance into their sanctuaries, erected the entire building itself in the form of the ophite hierogram. The entire building was in the form of a serpent. It says Abery in Wiltshire and Staton Drew in Somersetshire are interesting examples of this construction. The former represents the ophite hierogram with one serpent, the latter with two, the circle in each case being destitute of wings. The author tells us that the figure you see here in abbreviated writing among the Greeks signified the deity. The same figure was in use among the Brahmins, says Kircher. The deity for the universe and its creator were often confounded by the ancient heathen. The emblem is evidently the globe and serpents of Egyptian mythology. In the same form, was erected the celebrated temple of the Druids at Avebury, Wiltshire. The upright stones, which constituted the adytum and its approaches, correctly delineated the circle with the serpents passing through it. It says in China, this sacred emblem assumed a form unknown in other countries. They believe this was probably a representation of two principles claiming the universe. It goes on to say that the sacred ring between two serpents is very common on the triumphal arches of Peking. I'll drop down. It says, the most remarkable of all is the Mexican symbol. It shows two serpents intertwined. They form the circle with their own bodies, and in the mouth of each of them is a human head. A similar figure was assumed by the ophite hieroglyph when it appeared on the staff of Mercury and constituted a caduceus. The serpents intertwined formed the circle. It goes on to say Epiphanius says that the ophites, or the serpent worshippers, sprung out of the Nicolaitans and Gnostics and were so called from the serpent which they worshipped. The Gnostics, he informs us in another place, taught that the ruler of this world was of a draconic form, or dragon. The ophites, he observes, attribute all wisdom to the serpent of paradise and say that he was the author of knowledge to men. We're talking about the knowledge of good and evil. It says they keep a live serpent in a chest, and at the time of the mysteries entice him out by placing bread before him upon a table. Opening his door, he comes out, and having ascended the table, folds himself about the bread. This they call a perfect sacrifice. They not only break and distribute this among the votaries, but whosoever will may kiss the serpent. This the wretched people call the Eucharist. Pause and think on that. They conclude the mysteries by singing a hymn through him to the Supreme Father. So the above account of Epiphanius forcibly reminds us of the mysteries of Bacchus, in which serpents were carried in a covered basket, and in which cakes and new bread were given to the votaries. Now let's look at some excerpts from this book called Ophiolatreia, or Serpent Worship. It says this is an account of the rites and mysteries connected with the origin, rise, and development of serpent worship in various parts of the world. This book was published in 1889. It says Egypt, of all ancient nations, the most noted for its idolatry, was in its earliest days the home of the peculiar worship we are contemplating. A learned writer on the subject says the serpent entered into the Egyptian religion under all his characters of an emblem of divinity, a charm or oracle, and a god. Neph, Thoth, and Isis were conspicuous and chief among the gods and goddesses thus symbolized, though he is said to have entered more or less into the symbolical worship of all the gods. Now the book is going to go on to say that Bryant and Faber both derive the name of Europe from Arab, which meant the solar serpent. Whether this be correct or not, says Dean, it is certain that Ophiolatreia prevailed in this quarter of the globe at the earliest period of idolatry. In Greece, there are numerous traces of the worship of the serpent. It was so common indeed at one time that Justin Martyr declared the people introduced it into the mysteries of all their gods. In the mysteries and excesses of Bacchus, it is well known, of course, to have played a conspicuous part. The sign of the Bacchic ceremonies was a consecrated serpent, and in the processions a troop of virgins of noble family carry the reptile with golden baskets containing sesamum, honey cakes, and grains of salt, articles all specially connected with serpent worship. The first may be seen in the British Museum in the hands of priests kneeling before the sacred serpent of Egypt. Honey cakes, according to Herodotus, were presented once a month as food to the sacred serpent in the Acropolis at Athens. I hope you're seeing the same characteristics are being played out in all of these different religions. It says the most remarkable feature of all the Bacchic orgies is said to have been the mystic serpent. The mystery of religion was throughout the world concealed in a chest or box. As the Israelites had their sacred ark, every nation upon earth had some holy receptacle for sacred things and symbols. Now it says at the banquets of the Bacchantes, or rather after them, it was usual to carry round a cup, which was called the cup of the good demon. The symbol of this demon was a serpent, as seen on the medals of the town of Dionysopolis in Thrace. On one side were the heads of Gordian and Serapis, on the other a coiled serpent. The serpent was mixed up to a considerable extent with the worship of many other of the Grecian deities. The statues by Phidias of Minerva represent her as decorated with this emblem. In ancient medals, as shown by Montfaucon, she sometimes holds a caduceus in her right hand. At other times, she has a staff around which a serpent is twisted, and at others, a large serpent appears going in front of her, while she is sometimes seen with her crest composed of a serpent. It is remarkable, too, that in the Acropolis at Athens was kept a live serpent, who was generally considered the guardian of the place, and Athens was a city specially consecrated to Minerva. The author says it will probably be a surprise to many, but it is a fact that even in Britain in ancient times, Ophiolatreia largely prevailed. Dean says their British ancestors, under the tuition of the venerable Druids, were not only worshippers of the solar deity, symbolized by the serpent, but held the serpent independent of its relation to the sun in peculiar veneration, cut off from all intercourse with the civilized world, partly by their remoteness and partly by their national character. The Britons retained their primitive idolatry long after it yielded in the neighboring countries to the polytheistic corruptions of Greece and Egypt. It goes on to say, in the process of time, however, the gods of the Gaulish Druids penetrated into the sacred mythology of the British and furnished personifications for the different attributes of the Draconic god Hu. This deity was called the dragon ruler of the world, and his car was drawn by serpents. His priests, in accommodation with the general custom of the ophite god, were called after him adders. Now let's talk about some of the common characteristics that these pagan religions are involved in who worship the serpent. This article from the archaeologist is called "What Ancient Cultures Practice Human Sacrifice?" And we know that the serpent did require sacrifice. Here you see a list on the left, beginning with Mesoamerican civilization, ancient Egypt, China, Celtic cultures, etc. And I wonder why they list the continent of Africa instead of the countries or cultures that may have been involved in it. Egypt would actually be included because it is on the continent of Africa. But this says, in Norse and Germanic tribes, human sacrifice known as blot was an integral part of their religious practices, deeply rooted in their mythology and cultural traditions. These rituals were conducted to honor the gods, ensure good fortune, or seek guidance for important decisions. The Norse sagas and historical texts, such as the writings of Snorri Sturluson, describe various forms of sacrifice, including those at significant religious festivals like the Yule and midsummer celebrations. Victims, often slaves or prisoners of war, were sometimes, listen, drowned, hung, or burned in rituals dedicated to gods like Odin or Thor. One of the most notable sites for such rituals was the temple at Uppsala in Sweden, described by the chronicler Adam of Bremen, where human and animal sacrifices were said to take place every 9 years. Archaeological evidence like the bog bodies found in Denmark and Germany also suggests that ritual killings were part of the spiritual customs of these cultures. These practices, while sometimes viewed through a lens of mysticism and legend, offer a glimpse into the complex and often harsh spiritual world of the Norse and Germanic peoples. Let's go on. It says human sacrifice in various African cultures, though not uniformly practiced across the continent, has historical roots in certain regions and societies. These practices were often deeply entwined with religious, social, and political systems. In some West African kingdoms, such as the Dahomey and Ashanti empires, human sacrifices were conducted as part of royal funerary rites or during the installation of a new king, serving as a display of power and a means to accompany the deceased ruler into the afterlife with servants or slaves. And what you see here is an image of Molech. Parents would offer their children to include some of our ancestors to this deity. I covered this in the last session, but we can clearly see that these practices were common in various religions of the world, and these things are still happening today. So there are practices that are common in these pagan religions, and you see it in the lives of those who reject the ways of the Creator. Examples may include things like human sacrifice, sex rituals, to include pedophilia, sodomy, and orgies. Cannibalism and vampirism may also be involved. Folks doing these things are submitted to the God of this world. These things should not be named among the people of Yah. 1 John 2:16 tells us that the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but it is of this world. We also know that they normally tend to prey on the vulnerable, especially children. Don't overlook the spiritual significance of the Diddy and Epstein operations. They serve a purpose. It's also serving a purpose in religious organizations like the Roman Catholic Church. Why can't they seem to get a handle on pederasty? Do they really want to? Let's also remember that pedophilia was very popular in Greek and Roman societies. They saw it as a way to enlighten young children in the ways of love. This France 24 article says French Catholic Church inquiry finds 216,000 pedophilia cases since 1950. Shouldn't that be considered a major crisis? This article from Survey Center on American Life is asking this question: what's behind the rapid rise in LGBTQ identity? The report says since 2012, Gallup has tracked the size of this population in America, and for the first few years, there was not much news to report. The numbers remained relatively low, inching up slowly year over year. But the recent report recorded the single largest one-year increase in 2024. Nearly 1 in 10, that's 9.3% of Americans identify as LGBTQ. So what's behind the rapid rise? We know what it is, but a lawless nation will point to everything else except for the main thing that's really behind it. They say it has become a point of pride or a mark of social status, and it can also confer social benefits in certain contexts. What is it all pointing to? Lawlessness. These practices appease the forces of evil. Let me say again, our people were not immune. When they chose to turn away from truth and followed after the gods of the other nations, they adopted their pagan ways. When you read chapters 19 and 20 of the book of Judges, you will see that the tribe of Benjamin caused a civil war because they refused to deal with men who were behaving like the men in Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's read verse 22 of chapter 19. It says, "As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, 'Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally.'" So the old man tried to talk them out of this and offered his own daughter and this man's concubine to pacify the mob. This led to the concubine being brutally assaulted throughout the night. The next morning, he found her dead at the doorstep. So this man, a Levite, sent parts of her body to the 12 tribes calling for justice. Now you would think that the leaders from the tribe would agree that those involved should be held accountable, but they refused to hand the men over, and it led to a civil war between the tribes of Israel. When it was all said and done, 25,000 men who drew the sword in the tribe of Benjamin lost their lives. It nearly wiped out the entire tribe. What was at the root? A rejection of Yah's laws. This goes back to the scripture I read earlier. You cannot serve two masters. You have to choose. Refusing to do things in accordance with the Most High's will is choosing to align yourself with the God of this world. When you go that route, you may enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, but there will be a price to pay, because the wages of sin is death, and that's a price that many never consider. So we will end it here. I hope this message has been a blessing to you. Please remember to hit the like and share. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.